President Cyril Ramaphosa has quietly but decisively put two important laws into effect in South Africa, moves that reshape how police oversight will work and finally bring a long-delayed language practitioner regulator to life. These are not small bureaucratic changes, they touch on accountability in policing and the everyday practicalities of how language services are regulated across the country, and they arrive at a politically charged moment when citizens and civil society are watching governance closely. The first of the two measures is the commencement, via presidential proclamation, of the 2024 Independent Police Investigative Directorate (IPID) Amendment Act, with a handful of sections held back. That amendment changes the framework for how civilian complaints and investigations into police conduct are handled, modernizing key elements of the oversight body that investigates deaths in police custody, serious police misconduct and other incidents where police action is in question. The proclamation brings most of the act into force, although the government has explicitly withheld the commencement of 5 sections pending further work. For citizens who have long demanded stronger, more independent scrutiny of law enforcement, this is a concrete step toward a more accountable policing environment. Running in parallel, Ramaphosa has operationalized the South African Language Practitioners Council Act, originally enacted in 2014. After more than a decade of delay, the council is now active, meaning formal regulation, professional standards and registration for translators, interpreters and other language practitioners across South Africa. That has real-world consequences. A regulated corps of language practitioners can improve access to justice, ensure higher quality translation in courts and government services, and professionalize an industry that supports multilingual communication in one of the world's most linguistically diverse countries. For people who rely on accurate interpretation in legal, medical or public service settings, this will be felt as a material improvement over time. Why does this matter now? The timing is important. Both laws have been years in the making, but commencement is the final piece that turns statutory text into enforceable reality. The IPID changes reflect ongoing pressure to fix systemic problems in police oversight. South Africans have repeatedly called for stronger mechanisms to hold law enforcement to account, especially when deaths in custody or allegations of torture arise. The language practitioner reform addresses a quieter but equally practical problem. Despite South Africa's constitutional protections for language rights, the absence of a functioning regulator left gaps in quality and standards for interpretation and translation. Together, these commencements show the presidency moving to close legislative gaps that have persisted for years. There are, of course, caveats and likely contestation. With the IPID Amendment Act, the fact that 5 sections were excluded from the proclamation signals that implementation will be phased and that political or administrative hurdles remain. Implementation is where many laws live or die. Having a law on the books is one thing. Funding, administrative capacity, and political will to staff and resource the IPID properly will determine whether the changes deliver real accountability. Civil society groups and opposition parties are likely to scrutinize both the content of the omitted sections and how the government fills the practical gaps. On the language front, the operationalization of the Language Practitioners Council should produce quick wins. The registration systems, codes of conduct and complaint mechanisms can be set up relatively fast, but professionalization is a long game. Training, recognition across provinces and alignment with court and government procurement systems are all necessary to make sure the Council's launch translates into better services and opportunities for practitioners. Expect language NGOs, courts, and provincial departments to be important partners, or critics, as the Council scales up. Political reaction will be mixed. Supporters will call the moves overdue and necessary, reinforcing the narrative that the presidency is taking steps to strengthen institutions and service delivery. Skeptics will question whether the changes are substantive or simply cosmetic, and whether the government will match legal reform with budget and capacity. On the policing side, oversight advocates will be watching whether IPID gains the independence and resources required to investigate powerful actors. On the language side, practitioners and civil society groups will be watching the registration and accreditation rules to ensure they do not create barriers to entry or worsen shortages. Beyond the immediate policy effects, these proclamations are a reminder that governance often advances in incremental, technical steps that rarely make front-page headlines but reshape everyday life over time. Whether you interact with the police, need an interpreter in court, or rely on public documents in a language other than English, these laws will, if implemented thoughtfully, change the way you experience public institutions. They also present opportunities for advocacy groups to press for full and funded implementation, for trainers and universities to expand accredited programs for language practitioners, and for journalists to hold the state to account as it converts paper law into practice. If you want to stay ahead of how these laws are put into practice, from IPID staffing announcements to the Language Council's registration rollout, subscribe to this channel for plain language updates, explainers, and on-the-ground reporting that cuts through the legalese and shows what these changes mean for ordinary South Africans. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop a comment. Which of these changes affects you or your community the most? Your questions help shape the next video, where we'll track implementation, budgets, and the startups, NGOs and public servants trying to make the new laws work. Sources used for this report include recent coverage of the presidential proclamations and official government notices announcing the commencement of the IPID Amendment Act and the operationalization of the South African Language Practitioners Council. For readers who want to dig deeper into the legal texts and the presidential proclamations themselves, the Presidency and Government Gazettes provide the authoritative records. Thanks for reading. Subscribe and come back for a follow-up that tracks the first 100 days of implementation.